As mentioned, when I got the call from Dennis and Lux, and they asked if I'd come and give a talk, the initial premise was, hey, we're going to have this, it's around innovation, but we really want to get your perspective and have you kind of talk a little bit about the difference between, you worked at Dow for 20 years, $60 billion chemical company, now you're working at Albemarle, a $3 billion specialty chemical company. And what's the differences between, a large company and a small company in terms of how innovation is approached and how organizations look at that. And I'll get to that in the slide deck here. And I think some of these things that I talk about here, the 4 or 3 or 5, whatever number you want to pick, they really resonate across no matter what size of organization, no matter what industry you're in, and quite honestly, no matter what you're trying to innovate. So hopefully that'll come out a little bit. Look forward to questions as well. But if you step back and look at an innovation, I know there's been some fantastic talks this week already about innovation. A lot of it comes down to the culture. A lot of it comes down to the drive. If you're in an organization that's a for-profit company, obviously there's financial metrics that are behind a lot of the innovation that's being done in companies and things like that. And I think innovation ranges in every function. We typically migrate to innovation in research and technology and materials and things like that. But there's innovation that occurs in marketing. There's innovation that occurs in manufacturing and in all these areas. And I think you'll see in just the points that I kind of cover here, I think it resonates across all functions, across all companies, and across all industries in some form or fashion as you go through this. So, must-haves for innovation. Again, the key is setting expectations. And I think, we all have either led organizations or been in organizations where that's probably it seems like maybe the easiest thing, but also the most difficult thing, not only internally, but externally around innovation and setting those expectations up. So if you think from an internal perspective, you got your leadership, you got your management, all those things to set those expectations of what you're trying to achieve in a specific project or an area. But you also have expectations with your customers, typically, if you're selling a product or service. And that's one of the key things, and I'll go through a few components of that. But I've always been told in my career, never overpromise and underdeliver. And a lot of times we get caught in that battle in the innovation area of doing that, right? We want to have a great opportunity, want to have a great breakthrough, but we actually overpromise in a lot of areas and underdeliver. And that's where you see a lot of companies swinging back and forth on how much money they spend in innovation and R&D and different things like that. And I think that's probably the most critical thing. If you go back and do a case study on all your innovation opportunities that you've experienced through your career, I'd say that's probably one of the biggest things where expectations were probably not set properly at the beginning. So innovation's tough, and being able to set those expectations are absolutely critical. A couple things, if you look at it, that setting the expectations talks about, it's talking about budget, it's talking about planning, so strategic planning, and I'll get into that in a second to give some examples of what I mean by planning. Having the right resources and, quite honestly, the right leadership. In the end of the day, I think, if you get those things right, and the people and resources is not to be underestimated, obviously, but the strategic planning that you have to do. And I'm not talking about the processes, I'm talking about creating a culture of innovation, getting the right people in place. Being able to plan that out effectively is absolutely critical as you go forward. And quite honestly, in the end of the day, doing this right is worth waiting, because hopefully that'll deliver some big things for your company. So when it comes to planning, you always want to, usually from an innovation perspective, you're trying to solve a problem, right? You got a problem statement, you're trying to fix it somehow, whether it's an operational effectiveness or efficiency in manufacturing, or some way to approach marketing, or again, developing a new material. But being able to plan for success is absolutely critical. And what I mean by planning, it's what's the end game, right? And it could be a financial metric, it could be a product launch, it could be something else, but defining what that metric is, in my mind, and what the definition of success is, the core to any innovation that you go through. And being able to plan for that's absolutely critical. So when you're planning, obviously, from an organizational perspective, there's always going to be challenges and roadblocks that your group and your people are going to encounter as you're doing that. Being able to remove those roadblocks and make sure they're not there and don't exist is obviously critical. Look at the current state, right? So there's a problem. Why do you need to innovate? Why is there a need to innovate? And you know, I think if you look at the consumer electronics industry and the innovations that have occurred in there, there's clearly been maybe not so much a problem, but a need that we didn't even know we had in some respects, right? Apple and Samsung and all these guys have identified problems that we didn't even know we've had, and they've come up with innovative products and technology that has really changed the current state of the way we look at things. This is one that's really important. Examine your capabilities and really look at what's core to your organization. And I use this a lot in different talks around not getting too far away from your core. And innovation tends to stretch you a little bit further than you like to be in some cases. And I think in many cases, the reason some of this stuff fails is because it stretches you too far. So when you look at the next thing, enough time. Now this one's a tricky one. There's never enough time, right? I don't think we ever get an unlimited amount of time to work on the things that we want to work with. And you know, you can never go to your senior leadership and say, hey, I'm just going to go work on this. I'll come back to you in a few years and let you know how it goes, right? That usually isn't how it happens. There's timelines put in place, and there's really never enough time to do what you need to go do. But again, it comes back to being able to plan for what you need to accomplish and integrate that time frame in the right perspective. Innovation does take time, right? You probably heard that this whole week. It's not easy. If it was easy, everybody'd be doing it. There'd be a little spreadsheet that everybody could get off the internet and we can go and innovate in every area that we're in. It's not that easy, right? And you got to make sure that you have enough time. I think you'll see it a little bit later around being patient and impatient. I think that's a balance around the time spectrum that you have in the projects that you're working in. So that's also extremely, extremely important. So when you look at the time aspect of this, making sure that you're looking in the right places. Again, don't get too far away from your core. Take the time to do the homework. As you're looking at a project, you know, one of the things that no matter what process or area you're in, being able to understand where you're at today, you know, your is state, your future state, all those kind of things, that's extremely important, and understanding if you're in the right place or not, right? And I think there's some times where we try to do too much in innovation. We try to go out beyond our current capability, and that gets us in a lot of trouble. So go slow and steady. Again, like I said, it takes time. I think the biggest thing that I've seen over my career, and what I've actually had issues even myself in trying to manage, is to be consistent, right? There's always the need to do things faster, slower. There's, you know, economy changes, the budget changes. Economy changes, you get pressure to cut things like that. And that's where I think, you know, you'll see some of the biggest failures in innovation, where there hasn't been enough planning in place, there hasn't been enough time given, and people are a little bit, you know, they're innovative one day, and then when the economy turns, they say, well, we got to cut, you know, our R&D budget, or we got to cut our business development budget because, you know, it's just not delivering on the bottom line. Now, from a short-term perspective, that probably makes sense, and the shareholders who want a dividend and, you know, you want to manage your stock price, all those things probably make sense. But I think if you take a look at it long-term and you look at companies that have been consistent over time in investing in innovation, those are the companies that have been around for 100 years. They're still here today. They're still innovating, right? Companies that haven't done that, I think you've seen where there's challenges. And I've been fortunate enough to be in two companies now that I think have an extreme emphasis around innovation. And again, that's driven at top, and they've remained very steady and consistent in their goals and trying to innovate and trying to come out with new things. Invest calendar time. So again, this is something that deals mainly with organizations. And you know, I did an experiment probably about 10 years ago in my career, and we had an organization that was in the plastics area, and we knew in packaging there was going to be a wave of really neat technologies and neat opportunities because of some of the polymers being developed, but we just didn't know how to innovate in that area. So I was given the flexibility to basically go in and create an organization that really specifically looked around packaging innovations. And it was start from scratch, white sheet of paper, go find the people you need, tell me what your budget needs to be over the next 5 years, and then come up with that. And that was actually a very interesting process. But what it allowed me to do is create a dedicated organization that really that's all they thought about every day. Now, that's a very unique situation. You can't do that all the time, obviously. But I think, you know, that opened my eyes to we're all humans. If we focus on things specifically, we're going to probably achieve them and deliver them, right? So we're all driven by success. We're all driven by, accomplishing something at the end of the day. So I think that's also a critical aspect of making sure you have the people and the time and the dedication in your organization that's going to be able to do and deliver on those things. And then the last point, and this somewhat relates to time, but if you go out and look, I challenge us all to go out and look at probably the top 10 or 15 companies out there. Let's just say chemical companies, because I'm in the chemical industry. I bet you if you went out to their investor decks or what their CEO last presented in either their earnings call or their some bank event where they wanted to talk about their company, there's more than likely 5 slides in there about innovation, or at least a couple slides in there where they talk about innovation. And I think that's what's important is, and what I've seen change over time, especially in my time at Dow and now going forward in my time in Albemarle, is you see that to be a cornerstone of the executives' talk. And it's a cornerstone because I think everybody realizes the value of innovation. Not only investors get excited about that and they like your company because you're talking about innovation, but it also kind of stands for stability. It stands for long-term thinking and growth. And that's something I think that quite honestly has evolved over time and something that we can continue to do a better job at. So have that approach, which is important. Here's a couple quick fun facts. So if you look at a couple examples, pinball machine, 1937. It took 35 years to go from a pinball machine to an Atari. Now, it's a pretty big change. You got a mechanical machine pushing a ball up and down with a little bit of display, but then you go to a video game. Okay, 13 years later, the Nintendo system, and then 4 years later, you have the Game Boy. But, and this kind of shocks me because I always think, well, all the consumer electronics, all this stuff is just so fast and so innovative. Everything's coming so fast. But if you look at it, it took 21 years to go from a Game Boy, it's not an iPad, I understand that the leap change in technology from a Game Boy to an iPad is tremendous, but it took 21 years to get there, right? So innovation does take time. It takes a lot of time and a lot of energy. Now, have things changed on the iPad and the tab and all those kind of things? Absolutely, but it does take time to do those things. So the next one, again, the virtue of patience, and this is, this in some respects is related to time, but I think if you'll bear with me for a few minutes and look at this, patience is probably the hardest thing to do because there's all kinds of pressures we have. There's pressures around the people we have in the organizations. They want to accomplish things. There's pressures around, again, budgeting. There's pressures around being able to deliver on the innovation and deliver on that investment. One of the biggest things that I've always encountered is, when is this going to pay off, right? We've been investing for 5 years in this. We've been investing for 3 years in this. Whatever that time frame is, there's a lot of anxiety in that investment, especially when it's something new, right? And that's how I characterize innovation. It's something that's really new and differentiated out there. And this is one of the things that you'll see in any company is the businesses have a P&L responsibility, for example, especially if they're a for-profit organization. They invest in these things. They want to see a return, right? Or they ask, look, I've spent $50 million on this. I could have taken that $50 million and bought something, or I could have done something else with that money. So there's a lot of impatience that's implied in waiting for innovation, waiting for that to come through. But that, in my mind, there's 2 sides to it. There's patience and there's impatience. So I kind of looked at it from an R&D perspective, and because that's the one that gets the most tension around technology. But I think there's things where you need to be impatient, right? There's obviously things you need to be impatient. And the way I would characterize it is things that you need to be impatient are things that are impeding you from being effective in what you're doing and are impeding you from allowing yourself to be patient to get this development done. So, again, I listed a few here. Poor techniques, missed milestones, inadequate preparation. I mean, those are things that you got to get right at the first time. You got to be able to plan those things right. Otherwise, that's going to get people impatient in what you're doing. On the other hand, right, patience, results always take longer than expected. I honestly don't think I've ever been involved in a research project that has hit every single milestone. And if it has, you usually get challenged that you've been sandbagging and not doing, not challenging your organization enough, right? So it always takes longer. It always does. But it also allows you to look at multiple solutions. So if you do all the things right, the prep work, the planning, all those things right, it allows you to do some of these other things, and it allows you to have, and the organization to have more patience in these other areas, right? So I think these are some important things. There's subtleties, again, but I think if you step back and look at an example of a project you've been involved in, you can always go back and say, you know what, we should have done this better. We missed this milestone because of this. We weren't prepared. We didn't understand the market well enough. We didn't understand regulations or whatever it might be. If you would have had those things done in place a little bit better, you could have avoided some of that and actually focused on the things that actually mattered in the end. So being impatient in areas that impact efficiency are important, I think. Because everybody said, well, you got to be patient. You can't ever be impatient about innovation. Actually, you can. Actually, you can. So if you look at success and failure, again, success comes from being patient and impatient, and failure comes from being impatient and patient. Right? Now, what do I mean by that? So if you look at I mentioned the success part, but also failure. If you're not patient enough, you'll miss an opportunity, right? So if you look at areas where, again, there's been a number of examples where a company has sold the technology because they just couldn't get it developed and the market wasn't going good enough for them, or a product or an IP position, and another company turns it into a franchise, $1 billion franchise or whatever. There's tons of examples and case studies out there. And if you go back and look at what's the end result of those case studies, it's again, they were very impatient. They didn't understand the market. They got impatient with the customer base that they were dealing with, all those things. And that's, before I forget, that's another thing, right? You got a lot of set of unknowns in innovation. Usually there's a customer. You're trying to usually sell a product or a service. And unfortunately, you can't control the customer's time frame and all those things. So that goes along with the being patient and impatient. You got to be patient with your customers, but the more work you do with them, the more involved you are, the less you have to worry about that. So one of the things, and I tried to bring it home to Boston a little bit here, Mr. Greenwald, I don't know how many people know, he's an engineering graduate at MIT. He used to lead DuPont's organization. He had basically 4 principles, and these kind of resonate to what I was just talking about. Again, having a broad base, so there's a lot of great opportunities, and I saw this a lot in Dow, as well as looking across different business units and being able to leverage the understanding of different markets and how that applies to maybe an innovation that wouldn't be singularly viewed just looking at one space, right? So being able to apply that broad base of knowledge and information across business lines is important. Again, pick your problems with care and judgment. Don't try to go and solve the world. Don't get too far away from your base. I think picking the problem or the challenge that you're trying to solve is absolutely critical. There's tons of ideas and opportunities out there, and you know, organizations that I've been involved in, we've gotten too far out and tried to solve a problem and spent years of research on it and just realized that it's too far away. It's not the right problem for us to go solve today. And that, again, costs us time and money. Again, I mentioned be patient, and then last, know when to quit. This is probably the hardest thing to do. And I know a lot of people are shaking their head out there, but know when to quit. And a lot of it isn't based on data, because you can get all kinds of data and more data to prove yourself right or wrong. But I think a lot of this stuff comes from your instinct and from your gut, right? And it's hard to make these decisions. It's hard to shelve projects or end projects that have been going on for a long time. But no matter which organization I've been involved in, no matter which company I've seen or looked at or talked to, there's always projects that people say, we probably shouldn't have stayed working on this project for this long, or we have a couple projects we should kill, but so-and-so likes them and we're just going to keep working on them and see where we go, right? So you gotta use your instinct, and hopefully you're in a position to have that influence to be able to do that and know where to stop. So again, these are very common principles. I think he applied these when he worked at DuPont. He also worked in the Manhattan Project and stuff as well for the government, and they're very, very basic, but it's also critical. Last is team, right? So initially when I was doing this, I thought maybe I should put team first, because people, right? People are everything. At the end of the day, if you know the right people, you can have the best process in place. You can have the most defined problem in place. You can be as patient as you possibly want to be, but if you don't have the right people, you're not going to get the job done. And this is really tough, right? Because some of us get into organizations or into different parts of the company where we have a team that we inherit, and you're asked to go do something and you don't have the right people, right? But I think that's where we have to challenge ourselves. And again, the way I always look at it, and this was always told to me from a previous manager, is two things. One, you want the right people working on the right projects, because if you have the wrong people working on the right projects, that project will never be successful. And by the way, those people will get punished, most likely, right? So that's one important thing. The other thing is, if you don't have the right people and you get to a point where you're in terms of the time frame that you have and in terms of the expectation that you've set, it's going to reflect bad on you, but it also reflects bad with your customers, right? And at the end of the day, most of the time, 90% of the time, we're trying to innovate for our customers. Whether it's improving our manufacturing processes or trying to market things differently, we got a customer in the end of the day. Whether it's profit or non-profit, there's someone out there that we're trying to please, right? And if you fail in this area, you're failing with them as well, and you're wasting their time. So that's a tough one, and I think, again, having the right team in place is absolutely critical. So just a couple quick things, and I won't go over these in detail, but just an example. And I mentioned earlier about coming up with a team and looking at that, and it wasn't that I was looking for all PhD chemical engineers and chemists to come and help me do packaging, right? It wasn't. I had a person that actually had a psychology degree, believe it or not, because we needed to understand human behavior around packaging and understand how that impacted their choices in packaging and things like that. So I think you got to step back. I'm a chemical engineer by training. I have an MBA, but I'm a chemical engineer. And we always like to approach things from an engineering perspective. But I think in many cases, you almost got to step back and look at your customer base and think about what they're thinking for and why they're there. Most of the time in the chemical industry, it's usually very chemical engineering driven on how, or mechanical engineering driven on how things are solved. But I think at the same time, you got to really step back and make sure that you got the team built for success to be able to do that and the environment there to do that. Before I move on, I think that's one of the things when I mentioned this team that I had put together, the environment that we had in place was, quite honestly, the work environment that we in just it wasn't conducive for being innovative. And it was a normal office setting, so it wasn't like, and we had laboratories. But one of the things that I think worked really well is one day a week we actually didn't stay in the office. And when we had our team meetings, we actually had them out of the office. We had them sometimes at customer sites. Sometimes we had them at a company that helps out with it, being innovative, IDEO. You probably heard of IDEO. They were in Germany. We went to their offices quite often and actually used their space and used some of their people to help us out from those things. But I think, trying to mix that environment up also gets people in a different mindset, and also I think people appreciate that, being able to do those kind of things as well. So in the end of the day, once you have your team, you obviously have to be trustworthy. You have to trust the people that are going to do the right thing. You have to create, again, a safe haven, because there's always going to be pressure around innovation, how much time and money you spend around that. Be realistic, again, with the workloads and the day-to-day activities that you have with those people, and then be accountable, right? In the end of the day, I think all this kind of lines up with having a good plan, setting the expectations properly, and making sure that everybody's accountable going forward. So let me get to the main point. Does company size matter? And I think if you go back and look at all these principles, I didn't really talk about a big company or a small company or any of those things. Now, because I think all those principles applies no matter what size of company you are. But there are some clear, subtle differences in what a large company versus a smaller company can do. And you can pick how you want to define those. I have my references because of where I've worked in the past. But I think in some aspects it does matter. And I think there's positives and negatives on both. And what you see, again, and I'll go through a few, I won't go through all of them, but what I see and what I think it probably resonates with a lot of people is smaller companies can make decisions a little bit quicker, a little more agile, maybe closer to the customer because that's their lifeblood more than anything. Larger companies have more resources. They have the ability to have a better process in place, more streamlined. If a project fails, it may not hurt as much. If a project fails in a small company, it may hurt. It may be the end of the company, right, depending on the size. So, I think all these things are anecdotes and are little specific things of where the size of the company does matter. But in the end of the day, the fundamentals still are the same. You got to have the right people. You got to have the right expectations. You got to make sure that you're planning everything properly and that you have the right structure in place to be able to do that. So none of those things changes, but there are some subtle differences in terms of innovation. And I know, I mean, I'm not sure how many people in the audience. I know a few people out there that haven't had a chance to go to different size companies in their career, and I know them personally. And I've spoken to them, and we almost kind of all say the same thing, right? Larger companies just have the ability to absorb more things like cost and absorb more time and processes and things like that. They also have the ability to be a little bit more innovative in terms of the culture that they're setting. But smaller companies can be quicker, I think, in some respects, right? You can make decisions faster. You can still set that innovation culture up. In the end of the day, though, what I also believe is it starts at the top, right? If you don't have someone at the top of the organization, whether it's the CEO or the CTO or the R&D leader or whatever part of the organization you're looking to that's really has that as part of their core, that's where it all starts in the end of the day, right? Because if you're not getting that support, you're going to have a problem, no matter how big your company is. A few other points. If you look at, so again, I mentioned a few of these, but if you look at smaller companies, again, I think what I've seen in the past is they're a little bit more involved in the strategy. They're a little bit more involved in that innovation plan that's put in place, whereas larger companies, it's more of an overarching core strategy. The functions aren't integrated as much in larger companies in deciding on what is true innovation and deciding what are those milestones and what are those critical things going forward. And again, I can draw some examples of where I've been in Albemarle, where we have very dedicated teams that are looking at specific examples that are totally aligned with the business, that work on a pretty much daily basis to define what our timelines are, what our actions are, and how we are going to execute that across an organization, versus in a larger company like Dow, right? We have an idea. The business has, an overarching thing of we want to grow. The R&D group works together, and in some cases it works really, really well. In some cases it doesn't, where there's some disconnects, right? So that's probably one of the biggest differences there is disconnects and being able to manage that. All right. So let me just close real quick. And again, I think, for me, the biggest thing, if you look at the 4 points, and again, I can probably throw up, I can't remember what the other one was. I took one off there, so there's not 5. But if you look at whether there's 3 points or 10 points, it doesn't really matter. I think the fundamental things that you've probably all heard this week around innovation are all the same. My view, personally, is the tools and the processes those will get worked out. You can figure out how to do those things. The most important thing is all the planning and all the work up front, the people that you have, setting that innovation culture, setting the environment there. That's, for me, more important. And I'm looking at it from another perspective in terms of market intelligence as well within Albemarle. We're doing the same thing there. There's all kinds of tools out there about how to do market intelligence and how to get information. But in the end of the day, it's the culture that you're creating. It's the alignment that you have across the organization, alignment that you have with the business, the alignment that you have at the top to really make sure that innovation exists, that innovation actually can be driven through the organization. Because at the end of the day, the tools will come in. That's, like I said, you can buy some of those things right out there. You can get the tools put in place, the processes put in place. No matter if you're a large company or a small company, you can get access to those things. But having the culture, having the discipline to be patient, having the discipline to define success, have an organization that's committed and has the environment to innovate, in my mind, is fundamentally critical in the end of the day, no matter if you're a large company or a small company. So hopefully that, again, gives you a little bit of flavor of where I came from. And again, innovation's tough. Like I said, I'm a researcher at heart, and I think, for me, the biggest thing and the biggest challenge is, keeping innovation away from a bad image, because a lot of times, especially in down economies, it gets a bad image, and we tend to be over-aggressive in those areas. I think innovation is absolutely critical, and you see it every day. I mean, you turn on the TV, and the next big thing is here, right? So Samsung's always talking about the next big thing is already here, and that seems like it's every 3 months there's a new phone coming out from Samsung. Apple's got a new phone every 6 months. But it's all relative in the end of the day, right? It's all relative. And if you look at those organizations, they're committed to innovation. Not committed to the process of how they do it, although I'm sure they have fantastic processes. but they're committed to the culture. They're committed at the top on how to get innovation done and how to work together. So thank you.